Near London's bustling Borough Market, not far from London Bridge, an eerie discovery was made in 1989. While workers were digging for London Underground's Jubilee line, they came across the remains of over 15,000 people. This site tells the grim tale of poverty, disease, and social exclusion. But who were these lost and forgotten souls? And what can their remains tell us about their tumultuous and often short-lived lives? Hello everyone and welcome to the Resurrectionist podcast. This week we are going to be discussing Crossbones graveyards in London, which is this really interesting pauper graveyard in London that was discovered in the late 80s. Before we get into that, I just want to give an apology for the year-long delay in episode 3 coming out. I have a story, an interesting story perhaps, behind why this happened. I got called out on site in Kilkenny to dig up skeletons. It was my first time excavating skeletons despite being an osteologist, but it was a really interesting learning experience and it was an interesting site. I actually just finished cleaning the skeletons from Kilkenny, so I got to look up close at a lot of them, and there's some pretty interesting things showing up in those skeletons. I won't be doing the analysis or the report writing or anything, so I'm not gonna really get to see the results of that for quite a long time, but I'm hoping maybe someday to do a podcast episode on it, because from what I saw in the cleaning, there's some interesting things coming out of that site. While I was in Kilkenny, I actually got inspiration for an episode that's going to be coming out later in this season as well. But I was in Kilkenny for a month, and then I came home, and then 11 months passed, and now we're here. So you did hear right, I did say season. What going to Kilkenny made me realize is that running this podcast as a weekly podcast continuously just isn't feasible with my job and the way my brain functions. So I've decided to do it in seasons instead. This just gives me time to do the research, because this is a really research-heavy podcast. So it gives me time to do all the research in the interim, hopefully record some things before the seasons start coming out. And that way I can edit them and do the thumbnails and the descriptions and the SEO and all that boring behind-the-scenes stuff to a much higher standard, so that hopefully everything you guys get at the outcome of all of the work is of a higher quality, because I've had more time to be able to put into everything and I don't feel rushed to have to do things week to week. So this is season 1, and the first 2 episodes that came out last year are also included in season 1. There will be, I think, 10 episodes altogether, including the previous 2. So there'll be 8 new episodes this season. And the season will be concluding with a special Q&A, episode 11, a special Q&A coming out on Halloween. So be sure to leave your cues for me to in the comment section if you're watching on YouTube. I know Spotify also has a question function as well, so if you're listening on Spotify, you can ask a question there. I'm not sure if other podcasting platforms have commenting sections. I'll check it out. But if you want, you can also on Instagram at The Resurrection Woman. And if you want, you can leave me a voice note and I will play them in the episode. I think that would be cool. I'll also be taking comments from my Instagram posts as well, so you can ask questions there. I will have a special guest, hopefully, for this episode who will be reading out the questions, because I feel like that will just sort of facilitate a better conversation rather than just reading a question off the screen and giving you an answer. It'll hopefully facilitate a better conversation around the question and a bit of a back and forth, and, hopefully interviewer will be able to stop me and ask for clarifications if I'm getting too technical. So that's all the boring admin stuff I wanted to get out of the way. And now we can get into the very interesting case of Crossbones Cemetery. So Crossbones is an unconsecrated graveyard that is located in Southwark in London, which is near London's Borough Market and the old Operating Theatre Museum. It's actually, I think it's about like 1 street over and a little bit up from the Old Operating Theatre Museum. And if you have never been to the Old Operating Theatre Museum, I would highly recommend visiting it on your next trip to London. It's a very interesting museum. It's about the history of medicine and anatomical practices and stuff like that in London in the Victorian-ish era. If you're also interested in that, you should listen to episode 1 of the Resurrectionist podcast, where we discuss resurrectionism and Burke and Hare and medical study in the 1800s. And so it's located near the Old Operating Theatre. It's also not far from London Bridge as well. So the site was discovered in 1989 by Transport for London. So Transport for London were working on the London Underground to expand the Jubilee line, and they came across this site, Crossbones Graveyard. So the site covered 2,000 square yards. I have no frame of reference for what 2,000 square yards is. I'm really bad at gauging distance and weight and length and pretty much any kind of unit for measurement. Not my strong suit. But this site covered 2,000 square yards, and they found approximately 15,000 bodies, or the skeletal remains of over 15,000 individuals. They're not entirely sure because they haven't excavated the whole site. In fact, they've only excavated a very small portion of the site. So this is an estimation based on the part of the cemetery that they have excavated so far. So what they have excavated was 148 individuals out of that approximately 15,000. And so this makes up less than 1% of the site. But it does give us an interesting sort of glimpse at what was possibly going on at Crossbones and in Southwark in the period that these individuals come from. So I'm going to give you a little history on the Southwark area, on Crossbones Graveyard, and then we can get into those 148 individuals. So Crossbones opened in the 17th century and was used up until 1853. So from around the medieval period up into the Victorian period. And it eventually closed in 1853 due to being overcharged with the dead. Basically, there were too many dead people there and they ran out of room. So originally, when it was first opened, it was opened as a single women's cemetery. But in 1769, it became a pauper graveyard. So just general pauper graveyard, no longer just for single women. So historically speaking, the area of Southwark where Crossbones is located was associated with the promiscuous, the criminal, and the amoral, which resulted in the graveyard's association with poverty and disease. The area was under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Winchester, and as it was under the jurisdiction of a bishop and the church, it was not subjected to the laws of the king and the city. And as such, it sort of has this different legal system going on, and therefore there are certain things permitted in Southwark that would not be permitted in London as a whole. So some of these things include certain entertainments like bear baiting, playhouses like Shakespeare's Globe, and prostitution, all of which became pretty commonplace in Southwark, and all of which was licensed by the church. So the area was huge for entertainment, and people used to come over the river to avail of drinking, avail of the Globe Theatre and other playhouses, and to avail of the Winchester Geese. So who were the Winchester Geese, you may ask, and why do they have such a funny little name? Well, the Winchester Geese were the name given to the women who worked as prostitutes in Southwark, but who were licensed by the church to work in brothels and stews, and were presumably named Winchester Geese after the Bishop of Winchester. So in life, these women, being licensed by the church and associated with the bishop, would have been offered some level of protection by the bishop, and possibly would have been offered locations to work out of, brothels and stews that were also licensed by the church, so they could work out of these locations. And these locations would have additional security measures in place for the women's protection. I'm sure this didn't always work out, but they would have been better off than had they been on the streets. Of course, this level of protection required payment, so essentially, church and the bishop were pimping these women out and offering them protection in exchange for money. They were pimps. It was a full-on pimp situation. So while in life these women were offered some form of protection from the church, in death they received nothing. They were treated the same as any other paupers or any other people considered to have had a bad death. So there was bad drinking water in the area of Southwark, which led to poor sanitation. There was also overcrowding, and all of this led to numerous outbreaks of cholera and typhoid. There was a lot of criminal activity, such as prostitution, as we mentioned, but also theft. There was body snatching as well. And there was a lot of immigration into Southwark as well. So that was just, all in all, not the best place to be living. And I'm sure having people come over the river into Southwark to avail of this entertainment that was legitimized by the church in the area also didn't help with the criminal activity, because these people were drinking and were away from home to enjoy these illicit entertainment, and which probably led to higher levels of crime in the area as well. So the Victorian era is synonymous with the memorialization of death and the dead. We can see this in the photographs they took. You can see this in death masks. You can see this sometimes in the furniture. You can definitely see this in the cemeteries. They have huge mausoleums and huge gravestones associated with the Victorian era. Crossbones graveyard, on the other hand, stands as a reminder that this memorialization was selective and that the poor did not make the cut when it came to the selection. So in the Victorian era, only 2 mourners were permitted to attend a burial of a pauper. But even this 2 mourner limit was only reserved for those who were considered to have had a good death. So I have a little quote here that I guess kind of sums up what is considered a bad death as well. Prisoners, the poor, the lonely, and the socially excluded expired in dismal circumstances, unmourned and unloved. From unbaptized babies to criminal suicides, socially excluded women, such as prostitutes, were virtually granted a bad death. So unbaptized babies, individuals who committed suicide, women who worked as prostitutes, all of these were considered to have had bad deaths and therefore would have been permitted mourners at their funerals. So Crossbones graveyard was licensed by the Bishop of Winchester, but those buried there were not permitted religious rites, and it was an unconsecrated graveyard. The graveyard is often associated with prostitutes and single women. Like I said, it was originally set up for single women, and it sort of became associated with prostitutes because of this and because of the activities that were going on in the area and because of the bishop's association with the cemetery and with the Winchester Geese as well. However, there is no confirmation that the Winchester Geese were buried at Crossbones. So the author John Stowe, in A Survey of London, published in 1598, made mention of a singles women's churchyard in Southwark, which is believed to be Crossbones. Next on this, west bank of the Thames, was sometimes the bordello, or stews, a place so called of certain stew houses privileged there, for the repair of incontinent men to the like women. I have heard ancient men of good credit report that these single women were forbidden the rites of the church, so long as they continued that sinful life, and were excluded from Christian burial, if they were not reconciled before their death, and therefore there was a plot of ground called the Single Women's Churchyard appointed for them, far from the parish church. And again in 1795, in A History of St. Saviour's, Southwark, we have a quote that also seems to make mention of Crossbones as well. Our readers will remember that, in the account we have given of the stews on Bankside, mention is made of a piece of ground called the Single Women's Burial Ground, set apart as the burial place of those unfortunate females. We are very much inclined to believe this was the spot, for in early times the ceremony of consecration would certainly not have been omitted, and if it had been performed, it would doubtless have appeared by some register, either in the possession of the Bishop of Winchester or in the proper ecclesiastical court. God, I am dyslexic, by the way. Can we just appreciate how far I'm getting with reading out all these quotes? And I continue. We find no other place answering the description given of a ground appropriate as a burial place for these women. Circumstances, therefore, justify the supposition of this being the place. For it was said, the ground was not consecrated, and the ordination was that they should not be buried in any spot so sanctified. So, speaking of body snatching, as I mentioned earlier, there are historical and archaeological records of bodies being taken by resurrectionists for dissection in anatomy schools. There is even a report published in the 1889 issue of Guy's Hospital Gazette, which mentions an incident that took place in 1786. At the burial ground in Red Cross Street, named Crossbones, belonging to St. Saviour's Parish, 4 men, body snatchers or resurrection men, were at work and dug up a body and proceeded to put it into a coach and got away. So like I mentioned as well, there's the Old Operating Theatre Museum, which is a museum in an old operating theatre that is only a couple of streets away from Crossbones, so it makes sense that there was body snatching going on here. It is a pauper cemetery. There would have been no protections that richer individuals would have been able to afford, or no watchtowers that cemeteries for associated with churches and that had richer individuals interred would have been able to afford. And there's an operating theatre nearby. So clearly they would have been taking bodies from here for use in the classrooms. So there are also historical records of individuals who were buried at Crossbones. We do have the names of some people who were buried at Crossbones, and some people have attempted to take these historical records of named individuals and connect them back to some of the individuals who've been excavated from Crossbones. But like I said, it's less than 1% of the whole population that's been excavated. And so it's really difficult to say any of these attempted matchups are right. There is one pretty well publicized one I will be discussing it later on. But it's kind of iffy that they're doing this, because when it comes to like trying to identify people based on historical records, you're going off of like what little information you do have about these people in the record, and you're trying to match it up to these skeletons we have. And if you had the site as a whole, if you had every individual from the site, then this might make a little more sense. But when you've only got such a small number of individuals, it's really difficult to say like this is definitely who this person is, because while the remains that you have might bear a, let's say, 75% likelihood of being this named individual, the next grave over that you haven't excavated yet could bear a 95% likelihood of being this named individual. So we can't say that any of the individuals we have are these people. We can't say with any certainty. There could be people who are still buried there that are much more likely to be these individuals. And also, like, ethically, it's a little grey to be trying to name these people, because, like, we don't know who they are. The historical records probably are not hugely accurate as well. I mean, like, back in these days, like, people didn't even know their actual birth dates. They didn't know their actual ages. And our estimation methods are not always, like, very accurate. We get ranges, but those ranges can change depending on a number of lifestyle factors and stuff. So it's just really difficult to try to be matching them up, especially when we have only such a very small percentage of the graveyard's population to actually compare with. So the site itself was excavated by the Museum of London when it was discovered in 1989. And it sheds light on the poverty and the disease that was rife in the area, and sort of gives us a little more context to these historical records we have of Southwark. So like I said, there was 148 skeletons excavated and examined. These are thought to date to between the 1800s 1800 and 1853. So they're thought to date between a 53-year period at the end of the graveyard's use. So more towards the Victorian end of the graveyard's use, and more when it was starting to get very full with the dead right before it closed. And it only represents a very, very small, less than 1% of the individuals that are in total that are on the site. So when they were excavated, the individuals were found to be buried 9 to 10 people deep, and they were placed in pauper coffins, which I believe just means like very simple wooden boxes. That's it. They were laid out supine, which means flat on their backs, and they probably either had their hands to the side or crossed over their chests, and they were buried facing east to west, which is considered pretty common for the time and for the religious associations of the area. So some of the individuals were found with coffin plates, but not all of them. This may have been something that was paid for, it may have been something that was done in a specific time period or not in another. I wasn't able to find any information really about why coffin plates were used in some circumstances and not others. So let's get into the population breakdown as a whole. So over 33%, that's 1/3 of the individuals excavated, were found to be perinates. So this means infant individuals who died in or around the time of birth. Individuals who are predicted to have been around 40 weeks? I know very little to nothing about human gestation. 40 weeks, I believe, in and around there. We can't say whether they're stillbirths or whether they are children who died shortly after birth. We can't say if they are fetuses or if they're, fully developed fetuses, or if they were infants, like when they died. All we can say is that they died in and around the time of birth, so a couple of week period there usually, and that makes up, like I said, 30% over 1/3 of the over 33% over 1/3 of the individuals that were excavated at the site. So individuals under 1 year old, so above this perinate age but younger than 1 year, made up 11% of the population. So over 40% of the individuals from this site were beneath the age of 1 when they died, which does suggest a very high infant mortality rate for the population. But we're basing this off of the number of individuals that we have excavated and the population that we have available to study, the 148 individuals we have to study. While this suggests a high infant mortality rate, it could also be a bias in the area of the cemetery that was excavated, or the period that was excavated as well, the 1800 period that was excavated. So we're sort of just having to go off of what individuals we do have, but from what individuals we do have, it is suggesting a high infant mortality rate. And of the adults we have, most of them were aged above 35 years. Males dominated the young adult age groups, and females dominated all other age groups. So this is suggesting more of an even spread of women of all ages being buried at the cemetery, whereas males seem to be clustering in this young adult age group. We're also seeing that there is a high number of individuals buried under the age of 1, and then the rest of the individuals, most of them are aged over 35. So we're also seeing this sort of gap between age 1 and age 35 as well, which is interesting. And now we're getting into the paleopathology, one of my favorite parts when it comes to population analysis. So around 60% of the skeletons were found to have periostitis, which is a condition that affects the bodily tissue around the bones and can result in inflammation of the bone. So while periostitis can be associated with STIs, such as syphilis, it can also be caused by a number of infections, or can also be caused by repetitive motion as well. So repetitive running, jumping, repetitive lifting of heavy objects. Shin splints is an example of periostitis as well. So like I said, periostitis can be associated with certain STIs, but when it comes to osteology, we usually just state non-specific infection if we believe the periostitis is caused by infection, because it is difficult, usually impossible, to say what kind of infection is causing the periostitis, because it leaves no other markers on the bone to differentiate an STI from an infection caused by an injury from, I don't know, I'm not a disease specialist. I don't know the multiple different kinds of infection. So my point is that we cannot say with any level of certainty which infection is causing it, and therefore we usually just state non-specific infection. So while it can be associated with STIs in osteology, we can't say that it's an STI causing it, usually. So there are also signs of other conditions that are showing up in individuals from the site. We have signs of rickets or residual rickets. We have signs of healed fractures, of scurvy, arthritis, and dental caries, which is like cavities and things that you get in your teeth. And so all of this usually suggests a pauper population, or a population of individuals that are in poor health and likely had intensive professions, like labor-intensive professions as well. So rickets is caused by a vitamin D deficiency and is seen usually when the population gets more industrialized and more urbanized as well. Healed fractures could be associated with intensive labor or interpersonal violence. It can also be associated with poor health and poor nutrition, because this can lead to deficiencies in the bone, which mean that they are more likely to fracture. We're seeing scurvy, which is associated with poor nutrition. Arthritis could be associated with labor-intensive professions as well. And then dental caries is usually suggestive, in high levels, is usually suggested of poor health, poor dental health to be specific. It can also be associated with poor nutrition as well. So now we are getting into probably the most infamous thing to do with Crossbones Graveyard, and that is the 6.1% of individuals which show signs of treponemal infection, which is more commonly referred to as syphilis. So this is sort of one of the big things at Crossbones, which is also drawing in that sort of prostitution narrative that comes with Crossbones as well, is the level of syphilis that's in the site. So one of the most publicized individuals from this site is often referred to as the Crossbones girl, and she has become the most publicized individual because she had this very advanced form of syphilis, and it had done a lot of destruction to her bone before she died. She is thought to have been a young girl between the ages of 15 and 19 when she died, and she displays the pathological symptoms associated with a very advanced form of syphilis. And the form of syphilis she had, we can tell from the damage it did to her bones that it is not the congenital form of syphilis, so she was not born with it. She contracted it at some point in her life. So from the reports I've read, destruction that syphilis did to her bones was mostly in the frontal bone. Usually syphilis causes sort of degradation of the frontal bone and can lead to being formed pretty much all the way through the bone, or at least on the outer surface of the bone. In really bad cases, it goes completely all the way through. Also, you get collapsing of the nasal bones. Specifically, you can get around the bottom of your nose, where, like, right above where your teeth are, that can start to wear down almost completely, not completely, but it can wear down like pretty badly there in extreme cases as well. So from what I've been able to read, these are the two sort of main symptoms that she's got going on here that lead them to believe that she had this very advanced form of syphilis. So some researchers have suggested that she may have contracted the disease as young as the age of 9 years old, which is just super upsetting to think about. but this can't really be confirmed. It's difficult to determine when individuals contracted diseases. We do know that in order for syphilis to reach this advanced stage that she had, it would have to be contracted between 2 and 10 years before this individual died. She could have been 17 when she contracted it, or she could have been 9. 9, I believe, is the most extreme that it could be. So I get that that's probably why people are using that age, the 9 years old. But either way, she was very young to have been contracting syphilis. They're able to see that there were high levels of mercury in her bone as well, which has led to the conclusion that she was being treated for her condition, which makes sense. Mercury was a common treatment for syphilis at the time. If you've ever heard the old saying, a night with Venus, a lifetime of Mercury, this is what it's referring to. There's also evidence on the bones that suggests she may have had rickets as well, which, like I mentioned before, is a vitamin D deficiency. And it generally leads to, when we see it in the bones, it's generally because it's caused bowing of the lower legs. So the bones literally start to bow outwards, and it can be mild or it can be pretty dramatic in some cases. So clearly this individual had some level of bowing, and it's led them to believe that she may have had rickets in her life as well. So from this osteological evidence, it's led some people to believe that this girl may have been working as a prostitute from a very young age, which is, this entire case is just sad to think about, but that's like the absolute saddest part of it, I think. So like I mentioned before, people have tried to associate historical records of known individuals buried at Crossbones with the archaeological remains that they excavated, and Crossbones Girl is one of these ones. So people have tried to identify her, or have identified her allegedly as Elizabeth Mitchell, who was a 19-year-old woman, or 19-year-old girl, I would still think, who died of pneumonia as a result of advanced syphilis, and who was buried at Crossbones. However, this is a very tentative identification, and there's some issues with it as well. It's detailed in a documentary, which I did not write down the name of because that would have been smart. But there is a documentary they did on Crossbones, and in the documentary, they're sort of going over Crossbones Girl and trying to identify her, and they allegedly identify her as Elizabeth Mitchell. However, there are questions raised about the location where Elizabeth died, and therefore that her burial would not have been at Crossbones, that Crossbones would not have been the local pauper cemetery to where she died, and therefore she probably wouldn't have ended up at Crossbones, and therefore this cannot be Elizabeth Mitchell. I will leave in the reference list below a link to that documentary, or to find out more information about that documentary. There's also a paper discussing the documentary and the issues around the identification and the ethics around the identification, which will also be listed in the reference list down below. So I also want to point out that while 6.1% of the individuals found at Crossbones were thought to have had syphilis, this may not represent the entirety of the site, and it also may not be a large number of individuals given the pauper nature of the cemetery as well. So I was reading this case study that came out in 2020 that estimated around 20% of Londoners between the ages of 15 and 34 had been treated for syphilis by the age of 35. Now, this study was conducted based on a 1770s population, so before these individuals, but it sort of gives you an idea that, like, in the 1770s, around 20% of Londoners by the age of 35 had been treated for syphilis. So this 6.1% might not be a huge number of individuals given the population dynamics that are going on for this pauper cemetery. However, it should also be noted that when we talk about seeing disease in an archaeological population, we are only seeing the number of individuals who lived long enough for the disease to affect their bones. Generally, this is a broad generalization, but generally with diseases, the bone is the last thing to be affected. So in the case of syphilis, you have to have lived with syphilis for at least 2 to 10 years before it starts affecting your bones. And so if you are a very sick individual or a malnourished individual or, if you're one of these pauper individuals, your health might not be up to standard. Not up to standard, but your health might mean that you die of syphilis before it starts displaying symptoms on your bones. So this 6.1% are only the number of individuals who lived long enough for the syphilis to start affecting their bone. Now, you can do a DNA testing for syphilis. However, that wasn't done in this site. The site's from the 1989, like I said, so they weren't doing a DNA testing back then, but that might be able to give you a sort of better look at how many individuals at the site actually had syphilis. It could also, actually, I'd never really thought about this, but if you did that, would it give you a better understanding of the health of the site as well? Like if the number of people with syphilis dramatically went up after doing DNA testing, would it suggest that they were of poor health overall because they died sooner? I don't know. I didn't really thought about that. That's interesting. I'm sure somebody has the answer out there. 'Tis not me. I understand very little about ADNA. I was applying for a PhD that involved ADNA once, and I am not ashamed to admit I used ChatGPT multiple times to try and explain ADNA and the ADNA process to me, and I still don't fully get it, but it is interesting, and I do think it would be fascinating to use it to explore diseases in the past. I dropped out of science when I was 15, man. Even though I have a master's of science, I understand nothing. So Crossbones' association with syphilis has been used to sort of tie in this narrative that it was a prostitute's graveyard. Like I said, the level of syphilis we're seeing at the site doesn't appear to be dramatic for the period. It does not appear to be a crazy number of people to have syphilis for the population that it is. So it may not be the, I don't know, what's the term, silver bullet that everyone seems to think it is to prove that the people here had to have been prostitutes because there was syphilis at the site. There was probably syphilis in every pauper cemetery in London at the time. It seems to have been kind of going around. I feel it's also important to mention that women in this period, particularly in the Victorian period, in the Industrial Revolution period of London, especially individuals who were living in areas like Southwark, these women often could have been widows or single mothers, and if they were, they may have resorted to prostitution temporarily to get through periods of unemployment and to supplement low income or even to provide accommodation. So they could have had other jobs and worked as prostitutes on the side. They may have temporarily turned to prostitution to alleviate a financial burden of some kind. This idea that Crossbones was a prostitute cemetery, it could have been, if we look at a generalization of what prostitute is, it depends. So I just feel like this is important to mention because when we talk about prostitutes and a prostitute cemetery at the time, I feel like the intent is to state that prostitutes were all that these women were, that was the only profession these women ever had, and that they were just prostitutes. And that's not really the case. Like at the time, for women of low socioeconomic grouping, like they may have turned to prostitution temporarily. It would not have been an odd thing to have happened at the time, and that doesn't really make them prostitutes, I guess, in the same way that people, I feel like, intend it when they say it this way. When they say, like, oh, there's these prostitutes buried at Crossbones. Yes, there probably were. And at one point, I'm sure many of these single women that are buried at Crossbones had turned to prostitution. But does that make them prostitutes? if they were not prostitutes at the time of their death, or hadn't been for years. I don't know. There's a debate in there somewhere. I also think it's interesting to mention, did you know that it's possible that none of the women who were killed by Jack the Ripper were working as prostitutes at the time of their deaths? It's possible some of them had never even been prostitutes. Some of them were definitely prostitutes at one point in their lives, but there is no proof that any of them had currently been working as prostitutes when they were killed. It's just a sort of narrative that got perpetuated, I think specifically by the police and journalists, to make sure that the upper crust, the women of good standing, did not grow fearful of this Jack the Ripper. Don't worry, fine ladies of London, he's only going after the prostitutes. So I wrote this little ditty, which I feel like sort of sums up Crossbones and the sort of fact from the fiction of Crossbones. I'm just going to read it out to you because I'm quite proud of the little bit I wrote, and trying to memorize it and say it will not come across as well. So here we go. The archaeological analysis suggests that there was a high infant mortality rate, poor working and living conditions, and bad sanitation, which led to poor health. A majority of the dead were infants, and of the adults, there were more women than men. While the evidence of syphilis and rates of parasitis might suggest the graveyard served as a final resting place for prostitutes, it is crucial to consider alternative factors. The data may also reflect the vulnerability of poorer women in the Victorian era to diseases, potentially leading to premature deaths, especially during or after childbirth. It must also be remembered that if some of these women did work as prostitutes, either temporarily or full-time, it is not who they were and is not all they should be remembered for. I'm just going to give myself a little pat in the back. I feel like that's just what I want to get across in this episode about Crossbones. It is an interesting site, and I feel like it does give us a very interesting look into the sort of poorer individuals who are living in London between 1800 and 1853. I'm pulling that off the top of my head. I may have gotten that last date wrong. I think I'm right though. And it gives us a sort of glimpse at these individuals that probably weren't talked about as much in the historical record, or were generalized in the historical record. So it's an interesting site by itself. We don't need all of this additional bolstering of like, oh my God, it was a prostitute cemetery and there was all of these prostitutes who were buried here and this and that. And, it's an interesting site by itself. We don't need all of that hoo-ha around it as well, especially when, as far as I can tell from the osteological analysis, there's no real silver bullet to prove that that's what's going on here. Yes, there are a lot of women who are dying here, but there's more children than anyone who are dying here. So what does that say? And yes, there was syphilis at the site, but there's also other diseases, and it's possible that the rate of syphilis at the site is not even abnormal for the population. So there is definitely people who worked as prostitutes who are buried here, but that by no means that the site as a whole is a prostitutes cemetery. I also want to note that I'm pretty sure this cemetery is mentioned in one of Cassandra Clare's Shadowhunters books. If anyone's read those, I love those books. I'm pretty sure they're in the Infernal Devices series. There's like this ghost that's in a cemetery that will visit. I'm sorry, if nobody knows what this book is, you're not gonna get it, but I'm fairly sure they're talking about Crossbones Cemetery. If not in this one, I think they're definitely talking about it in the new one that came out. And by new, I mean a couple of, sorry, I'm looking at my bookshelf. I can't remember what it's called. Damn it. Whatever the one was with the blackthorn. No, whatever the other historic one is. So there's the one with Will and Tessa and Jem, and then there's the one with Matthew and James and Cordelia. Those two have Crossbones in it, or at least one of those two has Crossbones in it. I just can't remember which one. So there's a little pop culture reference for you. It shows up in a book. So I feel like it should also be noted that, like I've said numerous times, this population that we've studied here is less than 1% of the site, and it is only from the later stages of the site, like right before it closed down. So we're only getting a very small glimpse at a very small amount of the population from a very specific time. This is not the cemetery as a whole. And I just want to also highlight some of the myths around Crossbones. So some of the things that I've mentioned here in this episode, like that Crossbones was where the Winchester Geese were buried, and that the Crossbones girl was positively identified as Elizabeth Mitchell. These are things that are often portrayed as fact when it comes to Crossbones, when in fact they are just theories and they've not been fully proven out. So just keep that in mind if you are researching further into Crossbones, that there are definitely some things about it that other sources have sort of just stated are facts about the site, but when you look into it, there's no real proof behind them, or there might be some proof, but it's not very stable or not very tested sort of thing as well. So if you are considering doing more research into Crossbones, which I do highly recommend, then just sort of keep that in mind, that there are some things about the site that are just sort of presented as if they are fact. So if you are interested in doing more research into Crossbones, especially around this sort of fact and fiction of Crossbones, I would highly recommend Crossbones Graveyard, Excavating the Prostitute in Neo-Victorian Popular Culture, which is the paper I mentioned earlier that sort of talks about and explores the way in which television shows and documentaries may sometimes manipulate and misrepresent archaeological studies to fit into a sensationalized contemporary narrative of the past. So in this case, how the supposed evidence for prostitutes is used to present a specific narrative about Victorian period of London. And in this one, it specifically uses the Crossbones girl as a case study as well. How she's been sort of used to tell this narrative about Victorian London and this narrative about Crossbones Cemetery as well. So, we've gone through the history of Crossbones, the archaeology of Crossbones, but what about Crossbones now? So after the site was excavated, the writer John Constable and the International Union of Sex Workers have developed the former graveyard into a memorial garden as a shrine to the lost and forgotten women of history, which I think is a beautiful thing to do. There are often events hosted at the space, and these events are usually dedicated in some form to forgotten women and to society's outcasts. So it's become a sort of place for people to gather and reflect. It's become a cornerstone of the Southwark community, and there is now a plaque on the gate to the memorial garden which reads, Crossbones Graveyard. In medieval times, this was an unconsecrated graveyard for prostitutes or Winchester Geese, but by the 18th century it has become a pauper burial ground, which closed in 1853. Here, local people have created a memorial shrine, the Outcast Dead, R.I.P. So I think it's beautiful what they've done with Crossbones, how they've sort of turned it, they haven't just forgotten it once it was excavated and paved over it and sort of ignored its history. They've tried to remember people who were buried there and sort of used it as a way to remember all individuals who may have been forgotten in the past. I've actually been to Crossbones Cemetery, or to the memorial garden that's there now. It's a nice spot. If you're in the area, if you're visiting the old operating theatre, it's just one road up and one road across, I believe. So it's worth a visit if you're there. If you're not in the area already, maybe don't go out of your way. It's a nice spot, but wouldn't go out of my way to see it necessarily. Sorry, Crossbones. I feel like it is important also to note, if you haven't noticed, the plaque reads an unconsecrated graveyard for prostitutes or Winchester Geese. So even the memorial plaque is maybe not the most accurate thing. But anyway, that is Crossbones Graveyard. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and welcome back to the Resurrectionists. Thank you for tuning back in. I apologize for the hiatus, and to everyone, both online and in person, who's been asking me when the podcast is coming back. Now, it's coming back now, and also thank you that you were interested enough to ask me about it. So please, like I said, leave your questions for the Q&A session at the end of the month. They can be questions about the episode. They can be questions about the podcast. They can be questions about osteology in general or archaeology even. I will be taking all the questions, compiling them all, and having a super fun episode where I'm answering all of you guys' questions. I will also be linking a Google form down below as well, where if you have any suggestions for future episodes, you can leave it down there, because I have ideas for things I want to do, but I'm always happy to take other people's suggestions for what you want to listen to and incorporate those into next season when I'm working that out. So thank you guys so much for listening. I will see you next Morbid Monday for episode 4 of The Resurrectionists. Bye!